Three, two, one. Got with me here, Robert Killen. Do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself, what you're doing in the Eugene area?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tiger. I am the director of the Lane Small Business Development Center, and we've been supporting businesses since 1983. Are a team of advisors. We are a paid team of advisors, which is different than some other similar organizations in the area. And I've been running the program for the last 2 years. I've got an extremely diverse background that we can get into, but most recently I was with the Springfield Chamber for a number of years.
Nice.
And I just absolutely love supporting businesses, which over the past year and a half has been a valuable value to have because
Yeah,
there's been a lot of
COVID's
need.
been doing really well for small businesses. It's been helping a lot. All these different changes and regulations, so they probably just need help growing more than anything, don't they?
So during COVID, we actually had both ends of the spectrum. We didn't hear from anybody in the middle. We heard from a lot of people who wanted to know how to access resources, to access the mostly federal, but some state and local programs that were supporting businesses, because it was always difficult to navigate that process. And then at the other end, we did have businesses that all of a sudden found themselves booming and just didn't have the infrastructure in place to capitalize on that. So we worked on both.
Do you know Madison Core from Core to Core? She was a part of Eugene Rain, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was a guest speaker in the accelerator, the Eugene Rain Accelerator,
Nice.
a couple of years ago, and she was in that program, so I remember her.
I heard that her business is doing really well because it's online based, and people can't go to gyms and stuff. So of course, like businesses like that are probably like, whoa, we were not prepared for this influx of radical change from people from traditional, like I'm going to go to a gym to, okay, now you need 100 new trainers, in a month or something like that to hold up. But
for her, her business model was designed that way, and that's what she wanted to do from the start. And so she must have been in a really good position when this started because she'd already figured all of that out. The bigger challenge was, for example, the local yoga studio lead, his business, who had done everything in person and now is trying to move online and trying to figure all of that out.
And my understanding, so we spoke a couple minutes before we went on air, is that's the kind of business you deal with, not like the tech, the unicorns, but you deal with more of like foot on the ground people such as Jeremy Dirtball, shout out, who are just putting in the work every single day to kind of keep a city running. Because if you think of like, oh, a city of just tech, like you got to be able to go get food somewhere.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, yes, and so if you
improv guy.
So if you take a look at the different types of businesses, you can categorize them in so many different ways. And what I tend to look at are high growth or exponential growth, perhaps at one end of a spectrum, and then your local family restaurant that really just wants to keep doing that. So it just needs to stay steady. There's this whole axis, and there are lots of those different variables you can think about, from high innovation and versus a tried and true traditional business model. The world that Dirtballs is in is not necessarily high innovation, although I do believe there's high innovation in their menu. They also have the potential to be extremely high growth, because if they can build up their infrastructure, and that caught on globally, there's really very little limit to how they could grow.
Shipping costs are a surprising limit. I don't have any handy, but I made shirts for a while, and I realized, okay, I could make the shirt for about $2.50, but to ship one shirt was like $8, and I'm like, oh, well, there goes all my hopes of. So I'm like, to some extent, like the change between being a local business and being like a interplanetary business, but like all around the globe, is such a radical shift when you start realizing, oh, you need the logistics of shipping, and you actually need to buy the boxes, the tape, have someone pack them all, bring them. Like, holy cow, that's a massive shift for a company.
It is, and in your example, shipping one shirt is never an issue. But if you were to ship a container load of this liquid Death Mountain water
from from the Alps
to say China, the cost would be about a penny a can.
Really?
So the shipping costs are, it depends on volume.
Yeah.
You just have to set yourself up. You have to model it out and set yourself up with the model that works. So to get back to it, Dirtballs has the potential to be a traded sector business shipped all over the world.
You said traded
Right.
sector earlier, maybe before air. What does traded sector mean? Like,
So traded sector, great question. Traded sector means that we are creating something here where we have jobs that we are paying here in our community, but the product that we're making is being sold outside of the area. And because of that, the dollars that are being paid for that product are being imported into our community.
nice.
So if we create something here that people outside of our community purchase, we're essentially an influx of dollars.
Yeah.
And the more we can do that, the more dollars we have recirculating in our community. It makes it work better for everybody.
So I just need to figure out a way to fill a whole container ship with my shirts and then get better shipping prices.
There
right?
you go.
Bring in some money from China or some other place in the world.
Yep.
It's interesting. I never thought about that because you always like look at, okay, owning a small business and like some money gets taken out of the circulation of a small town through the government by you getting the money and then paying your employees and then them going and spending it. It's like, wow, there's a constant outflux. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
quite a word of money from an ecosystem, but it's like you never really think about like how does more money get added into it, you know?
And that's how. And
Traded economy.
traded sector.
Traded sector.
Traded sector. It's a buzzword for the economic development world because you're constantly trying to build that up.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that our work at the SBDC and all of our partners, SCORE and RAIN and Onward Eugene, all of these organizations, the great value in that is that we're helping small, locally owned businesses gain strength, gain in their ability. And by doing that, they have the ability to displace, say, chain stores. And if you've got a really great product that somebody buys from you here locally, as opposed to ordering on Amazon, imagine you've got an Amazon purchase for $1,000.
Yeah.
How much of that money
Goes back into Eugene.
goes back into the community? None.
Yeah.
Zero. The only thing is a tiny amount for the person who brought it to your door. That's it. Everything else goes outside of the community.
I mean, even the person who brought it to your door, I mean, I guess it's his pay, but I was going to say FedEx and UPS, they're probably not really Eugene companies.
True.
Wow.
True. As opposed to that $1,000 spent on a locally created product, imagine 15% of the cost is actually materials that were purchased outside of the area, but you could still expect to see 60 to 80% of that $1,000 staying in the community and then used to recirculate.
Taking that into account as like a guiding like goal for like a good direction for a city to head in, but understanding that the trend's overwhelmingly in the opposite direction. Do you see like any foreseeable ways to kind of counteract that or deal with it, or like,
Well,
what do you do when it's
can,
like everyone's going one direction?
You can play the game and be an Amazon vendor, right?
Yeah.
You can put your product on Amazon so that people are at least sending you get the profits at least.
Yeah.
But so that's what it is. It's a function of figuring out a way to create value that people want from somewhere else. And there's also value in just creating a local business that local artistic businesses build culture that cause more people to want to come here. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to build local businesses. There are very few reasons to import like chain stores and large companies that are really, even if they are providing wages, if they're providing good wages, good on them. Companies like Wayfair here, they've come in and they've done a pretty darn good job. We're thankful that they're here.
But then that darn Taco Bell with that delicious Crunchwrap Supreme, undercutting all the local businesses and stuff like that. It's such an interesting place because I'm like, to some extent, could you legislate around that? Like Vermont doesn't have billboards or something, or maybe the billboards have to be a certain level low. Could Eugene just get together and be like, no more chains? Or like, can you, I mean, because imagine the amount of innovation that would occur in terms of local businesses that would flourish rather than all the money being sucked into the chain.
So you would think that would work, and you could probably make some adjustments like that. But if you try and make whole scale changes, you end up disrupting like the employment landscape. I mean, people have to have a place to work. Ultimately, everybody needs an opportunity to to trade their time and energy and skills for dollars. And those chains and those larger companies, they do serve to keep people employed. So we've got to at least give them that. But it will always be a battle. There will always be somebody out there fighting to increase the number of small locally owned businesses, because it's just better for the community.
So is it mostly government or like a local government funded, like state, city funded programs that help create more local businesses? Or like, what do you mean there's entities fighting for that? Or like, are you saying VC people who are like, I'm not hunting for a unicorn like the next Google. I want to help mom and pop shops around town. It seems like a big ask for people to be like, I know that's like, as you said, venture capital is sexy. It's like, no, don't do that. Help out the community, because think about like the bigger in terms of almost like universal gain you get for that kind of work.
That is
hard to pitch to people.
That is $1 million question right now, because venture capital only works because of the potential growth, the potential outcome of that investment, a 10, 20x investment.
I mean, people say about angel funds, if you take out the number one best returning, almost every single one's negative.
Yeah.
So
So how do you get equity investment in, say, a rural town in Oregon? How do you make that happen? And there are
there's never going to be an exit.
No.
Any of this.
No.
All the metrics that would get people to typically invest are out the door.
Yeah. So the only way that works is when you have local people in your community who've made it good and want to invest. And that's how they want to do it. They want to do it by supporting local business owners. We've seen examples of that. The Cottage Grove Chamber and Cottage Grove community sponsored a business challenge for a couple of years that was funded by a local business owner who'd made good and brought a check to the chamber and said, hey, I want to support small business.
That's awesome.
But can you replicate that everywhere? It's not a model that's replicatable unless you just happen to have someone of like mind.
So would you say this is the benefit of governmental intervention in like capitalism per se, or free market, is kind of allowing the cogs to still work without just being like, everyone's like, oh, I'm just looking for 100x, or I'm trying to create these like Ethereum racing horses, or whatever people are doing. It's like some level of like the world that we're currently living, some level of governmental interaction is needed, or intervention is needed to keep the wheels turning. Or like, I mean, could they all be so that is really like a wonderful world where it's like, yeah, every business that succeeds pays it forward. It's like, man, wouldn't that be gorgeous?
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. Until we've got that figured out, we've got to have resources for the 98%, 99% of businesses that are not in that VC target world.
You threw out the numbers before we went on air. You should say them, because those blew me away. I was like, I thought of 20, 80.
Yeah. So depending on who you listen to, I found two reports that describe the number of businesses that have received VC investment that are alive right now. Mm-hmm. Kauffman Foundation, in a report by them, said 0.5%. And another report, I can't remember the source right now, but another report that I've got stored on my computer said 0.004%.
It's on a slide deck somewhere.
Yeah, sure. But I've heard numbers as large as 2%. But even if it's that, we have to recognize that 95 to 100%, 95 to 98% of businesses are
restaurants, mechanics, everything that allows you to actually live your day-to-day life.
Yeah, they're just the functioning businesses in a community that keep a community going. Yeah. And the equity funding world is it's never going to fit there. So that is where I believe, and I'm funded for this, I'm funded because of this, but I believe that there is a need for public dollars to be supporting those business owners, because the reason organizations like ours exist is because they've done studies and they've found that business owners don't know what they don't know until they need to know it, and then it's too late. So
typical of all humans in life, every aspect of it,
Absolutely. And to have a mentor, to have somebody you can go to when you're staring down the face of a obstacle you just don't understand, to be able to go to your local SBDC and say, hey, I'm looking at this problem, can you help me? Go to your local SCORE organization, which also provides free and confidential advising. Go to RAIN, go to those organizations that are funded to support businesses, and
it seems
get
like an
that
easy
support.
pitch to like everyone, even like small government people would be like, oh, my tax dollars are being used for that. who would ever like? So is there any trouble funding this at all? It seems like this would be the easiest thing in the world to get going.
The SBDCs were started in 1980, and there have been very few times in the history of funding. They're funded and organized by the SBA, the Small Business Administration out of D.C. So it is a federal program.
Interesting.
And there have been very few times when it has been under serious attack.
Yeah.
Given all of the changes, the back and forth of politics, the SBDCs are pretty well loved across the aisle.
Do you know, and maybe it's not even a real thing, but there's like dollar amounts put into some things where it's like for every $1 invested in creating a public park, something like $2.50 comes back to that city by tourism or by people like, I don't know, being happier maybe, but for whatever reason, it seems like every dollar that goes into allowing just a small business owner to actually get their footing, because it is daunting. I mean, even I'm literally running a show, which is one of the easiest, cheapest things in the world to do, but I'm like, it's a big task if I'm, literally working 10-hour days just to pay rent in a place that's increasing all the time. And you're just like, no one has the energy or the time to kind of get going, and then much less raise capital, and then what your friends and family. So it's like this big wheel where it's like you almost need something to grab onto. I think the only thing, like, and it wouldn't even be worthwhile pushback. It's like it tends to, when places get too much funding, they almost blow up in an administrative way. Like I'm specifically talking about hospitals and some things where it's like you start seeing it's like more money that goes into it. It creates more bureaucracy just to keep jobs around. It's like, hey, we're going to hire a department to finish a task, and the task never ends, so that nobody ever gets fired. And it's like that's like the people's biggest pushback against any sort of funds in the government. But that doesn't seem real in a place that's like you don't create laws for local businesses, do you? Or like how do? Yeah. So.
Yeah, in our case, there is a figure out there. I shouldn't even mention it because I don't know if my memory is correct. 2 years ago, pre-COVID, I could have told you this number, but I
crazy. We're starting to say 2 years ago, pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, yeah.
Not a year ago. What's going on here? And you said 2 years ago. I'm like, oh, it is almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
That's brutal.
But the numbers, the SBA, they list the numbers, and I should look them up, but it's something like a 5-to-1 or 7-to-1 investment. So there are dollars invested in the SBDC system across the country, and they consider the return on that in economic development associated with the business we have helped keep alive and grow to be a 5 to 7-to-1 return. So it's
sounds like
it's
too
pretty
good of a
easy.
pit. It sounds like everything that you're saying sounds like one of those too good to be real kind of things where it's like, I mean, I assume every city has one, but why aren't they just bigger already? It's like, I know a fair amount of small businesses in the area, and a lot of like the owners of them haven't taken a weekend off in a couple years or stuff like that, where I'm like, why is this becoming even increasingly more difficult to start up a business? It's like we really are like the trajectory is no small businesses in 100 years.
Yeah, and that frightens me. I tend to discount. I tend to discount the end game there because there are just too many people who don't fit the traditional employment model. There are just too many people who need to have their own way to chart their own path. So I think there will always be a need and a place for entrepreneurs to get off the ground and provide value. But why aren't we better? There are a couple of reasons that I can point to that we are not better known. One, SBDC sounds like a government entity, and people just
I just
does.
hate it already.
Yeah, right.
You explain it for 5 minutes. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm on board with that.
Yeah.
But initially, wait, federal?
Yeah.
Interfering with local business? Hold the phone.
Yeah, it is a very well-known brand like the SBA, but it seems like a government entity, and so there's a just, I don't want to call it a distrust, but just a shying away for that reason. In addition, for whatever reason, because they're federal funds and everybody's very concerned that they're being used appropriately, we're extraordinarily limited in our marketing capability. They don't let us use our funds to market the programs.
More funds. Yeah, because, marketing,
Yeah.
Oh,
and even though, so that is the case, even though we receive more funds here in Oregon, we receive more funds from Business Oregon and more funds from our host institutions. And we're all attached. The SBDC centers like mine around the state are attached to all the community colleges. And we receive more funds from those entities than we do from the SBA, but we are chartered by an SBA subcontract. So the SBA really runs how we can do things.
Yeah. So, I mean, even though it's not even their funds, they get to dictate the bureaucracy and the steps that you have to go. I mean,
A little bit.
Kenzie and I were on a nonprofit for a while, and even that, a nonprofit has so many rules and layers behind how you're appropriating funds, and it's a headache in and of itself that makes it to the point where it's like, who would want to take on that task? But you did. Did you initially have a small business and kind of leapt to this, or did you just say from the start, I don't have a small business, but you know who I want to help in this world? Small business.
That's a really good question. So I have had, I was a professional artist for a few years running my own business as an artist. I've had some side gigs.
I'm so curious. What?
I was a watercolorist early on in my life.
Very cool.
And did that for several years until got married and realized that it probably wasn't going to serve me long term. So I became a designer and did design work and branding for about a decade. Then finance, and then I'd done a lot of different things.
So you did finance for a while.
Yeah,
So
I
you
was
have
a banker.
A portfolio of stocks per se.
No, not that type
And
of
it's
finance.
not all Amazon.
No.
You and your free
No.
time, I'm playing both sides, so I always come out on top.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's the way it works. No, I was a banker. I was a commercial lender and branch manager for a couple different banks for better part of a decade. And then in the downturn in 2009, I left. It just kind of showed its ugly side, was no longer interested. And then,
But prior to 2009, you want a home loan? Here you
oh
go.
my God, it was just,
you were
it was ugly. I actually, it was even for me as a banker, I actually purchased a home during that time when I was a banker. And the lender, who was a guy that I had been referring people to because we had a hard time getting it done internally at the bank at that point, he wouldn't sell me a 30-year fixed mortgage.
Interesting.
He didn't even have that product. He only had
Variable
short-term ARMs, variable rate mortgages.
Yeah.
So I had to go somewhere else. But he was the guy I'd been sending everybody to.
Wow.
It was really scary.
Perspective.
Yeah.
Hold up.
Yeah.
Spend 3 years sending people to him, and then you go to him. Well, that was a big mistake.
But I discovered my oversized empathy for small business owners when I was a banker. I had to think about where it came from and realized that when I was a kid, my stepdad, who was my dad from the age of 4, he had his own business before he and my mom got married, and he had that business for 15 to 20 years. And then in the mid-'70s, he ran into a problem where some of his biggest clients weren't paying timely, and he was running out of money, running out of cash. Pretty typical problem, especially at the start of a downturn. And he didn't know what to do. Eventually, somebody said, well, you should find some investors to tide you over. So he did that. He went out and got some investors who
sold 30% of his company.
Sold a portion of his company. And a year later, the family was down in Sacramento waiting in the car while he was in this meeting with the investors to figure out how he was going to get out of his company.
Wow.
Because they had made life so miserable for him, he just couldn't handle it anymore. And when I reflected on my empathy for the small business owners, it went back to that moment, sitting in the car waiting for my dad to come out of that building. I realized that in my role now, I want to be that person who can give a business owner the advice that can get them through, the advice that will allow them to survive. And
which can be a lot more valuable than actually just getting investor money, but it seems so appealing. Oh, I get money that I pay back later compared to bootstrap and figure it out, and there's a ton of resources, but it just seems so out of reach, even though it's like online all the time. Like the level of steps to like get into college or all these different avenues in life, and I'm sure like I just haven't started a small business, so I can't relate to that exactly. But I can imagine it's just so daunting between all the forms you sign out, and then they take 3 weeks to get back to you, and it's just like, holy cow, you know? So.
Well, the processes to just get a business started, yes, they can be daunting, but the real trick is, again, getting back to this concept, the business owners, nobody starts a business because they know and love employment law.
Yeah.
And nobody does. Nobody
know
knows what marketing actually means, right? They get into business because they love to do a thing.
Yeah.
They love to help people in a certain way. They've got a skill that they want to be able to exercise and get paid for, whatever it is. That's why people start a business. But the machine, a business is a cash machine, right? It is fueled by cash, and hopefully, if it's all working correctly, it is actually generating more cash than it takes to run it.
Alchemy.
Right? That's what a business is.
Yeah.
And when you think about it that way, you think about it as a collection of systems. There's your marketing, your sales, your vendor relationships, receiving, inventory, manufacturing. These are all discrete components that work together to accomplish something. Every business has its workflow. It has its blueprint. And if you think about it in those terms, almost every business owner knows nothing except one part of one of those components.
Yeah.
And everything else is something they either have to pick up as they're going along.
It's not what they wanted. It takes them
No.
away from what they wanted
Yeah.
and why they started in the first place.
Yeah. So the more help that they can get from an organization like ours, the less they have to put out fires. You know, business owners are constantly saying, I can't create the systems to keep fires from starting because I'm spending all of my time just putting out the fires.
Yeah. I mean,
And it's just,
it might be a little bigger than a small business, but next door Arcimoto, like I just heard that they're like, yeah, well, we're just about to get legalized in Hawaii. And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, every single state has to go through a legalization process for a company to like, and I'm like, I get it. You need like people to be safe and all these different things. But I'm like, wow, that's a massive hurdle from shifting to like 2 green and electric vehicles or whatever shift people are making, like introducing a new thing
Yeah.
is like,
It's
oh, you have to go
massive.
through legislation and every state in the U.S. that you want to like be a part of. And I'm like, what is going on with this? You know, seems like, I mean, I can't imagine how bureaucratic the world's going to be in 100 years or 50
Yeah.
years if we make it that far.
well, it'll be interesting to see because I'm actually seeing a shift. I'm actually seeing a shift away from bureaucratic nightmare
Nice.
because of the ease, specifically of international sales. You know, if you want to build a business and create relationships and sell internationally on your own, that's really complicated.
Yeah.
But you don't have to do that.
Who do you even know who to call?
You can go to
Really
you know,
don't.
if you sell through one of these big marketplaces like Amazon, right? Amazon will handle everything.
Yeah.
You know, and yes, they take a cut, but all of a sudden you have
Big cut, isn't it
access to
like
the
30% or something?
Kind of worth it.
it can be large. It depends on your product mix, but it's but to have access to the whole world, you know,
Yeah.
we're seeing more of that, and that might actually make it easier to sell, say, to Europe or to Asia than to Hawaii
Set up your own
or
supply
Idaho.
lines, yeah.
You know, it might actually get to a point where it's easier to sell
Wow.
internationally than it is to sell domestically.
That's
We don't know
absurd.
that,
Yeah,
but
directions and trends.
Yeah.
I got to call back to a couple minutes ago. You said
Yeah.
you used to be a banker. Did you see that movie Yes Man when it came out with Jim Carrey in it about the banker? Did you like that movie? That's
Yeah.
like one of my favorite movies of all time. Like seriously, that was such a joy of a movie to watch.
yeah.
Did you watch it? And, like, because whenever you see movies, like if you're a musician, you see like the musicians playing, you're like, you know, that's not accurate. He's not playing that guitar right there. Did you, as a banker, watch that movie? And you're like, that's wrong. That's inaccurate. It was-
Almost every. So they're a great thing. Banks do really good things, and almost every movie that has positioned a banker as. Well, actually, you see both sides in bank. So one of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life, right? So you have two banks. You know, you've got Mr. Potter over here, who's the big commercial bank, and then you've got George Bailey, who's, you know, the nice friendly bank who's trying to help the community.
Everyone in town.
Those all exist.
Nice.
Those all exist.
Interesting.
I recently switched from Chase to Oregon Community Credit Union for that exact reason. That movie was the I'm kidding. That movie was but something along those lines of like, why am I allowing a big multinational, like a massive corporation, that you realize how much money they make in overdraft fees each year? And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's suspicious, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great example of a shift to buying local.
Yeah.
You know, setting up your banking account in a local or smaller regional bank, it supports the region that you're in.
So in a way, is someone who like sells stuff on Amazon, you're supporting Amazon, but they sell their traded sector in terms of they export goods and bring in money to the community?
Well, yeah.
Would that be a positive thing then? Even though you're like using
even though you're using Amazon, yes, it would. If you are being successful on Amazon, let's again, think of dirt balls. So imagine they create a production facility and they hire 7 or 8 or 10 people to make those
I think
in
he
large
has that
scale.
going right now.
Okay.
Maybe not
Okay.
large enough to serve the world, but
Yeah.
he has a production facility that he doesn't have to make them anymore.
Okay, so perfect. So
Moving on up.
he's employing people, and by selling on Amazon, he's not only is he bringing profits in, but he's
Yeah.
also bringing wages to all of those employees, and so their family gets their portion of the cash.
Yeah.
And any local suppliers that they're using, I don't know where his supplies come from, but any local suppliers are getting their portion.
Awesome.
So
What do you think of the digital nomad movement? Have you heard much about that?
describe it for me.
It's so people find really high paying jobs and they move to lower cost
Oh,
living
yeah.
places.
Yeah.
So a job that was posted here, but it's technically you don't have to live here or go to meetings here, then they just move to, Burma or like anywhere that's really inexpensive. Then in many ways, that's probably drawing money away. It's more than anything, just talking to you, it's never been put in perspective of the flow of money to and away from a community.
Yeah.
And I'm like, now I'm going to start seeing every dollar I spend in this way. I'm like, is this going into Eugene or is this going out of Eugene? It's fascinating to start thinking about that.
Yeah, it is. And once you start down that road, it gets easier to pay a little bit more for something local. Like I live in Coburg, and we don't have a grocery, but we've got Dairy Mart, right? And Dairy Mart has fantastic milk. It's Lockmead milk. It's actually it's the same company. So Lockmead and Dairy Mart are the same company.
Nice.
I can smell the cows in the summer where that milk is coming from.
Nice.
And I will pay $1 or more a gallon for that milk because that money is staying right here. If I pick it up at Costco, then that milk, only a tiny portion of that little investment in milk that I'm making is staying local. So it makes it easier to start making those investments, and you begin to think about your purchases as an investment in community, more than just the purchase of the thing that I need.
I like that. And especially if you own a small business, you see it coming back to you because then more people in the area have more money.
Yep.
Tricky stuff. Whoa. It's almost like a circle the way it should run. Yeah, it's just, so you've, as a banker and then all these different things, you made a shift from watercolor to thinking about money your whole life. Was that pretty much, do you have kids?
I do.
So it's probably right when you got married and started having kids, you probably looked at the art life kind of fading away and looking to the banker and small business life kind of coming toward you. Do you like this shift, or do you wish will your next shift be back to art, or do you think this will kind of carry on?
That's a really good question. I actually made this shift. It was very intentional. It would have been 1999, a couple months before my first son was born, and I came home from working, and I was in design. I worked at the time for a large screen print embroidery promotional products company doing brand work.
Nice.
And I enjoyed the work, but I came home, pulled into the driveway, and my wife had gotten home before me. She was in the kitchen. I could see her through the window, and she was a teacher. And I realized that day, she had positively impacted the lives of 135 kids. And she did that every day. And I spent my day unsuccessfully trying to get a picture printed on a t-shirt. And that I had a crisis of purpose in that moment.
And you were how old at that time when you had your big crisis of purpose? How old were you?
How old was I? I would have been, can't do the math, 36, 37.
So classic midlife crisis.
Yeah. Oh, I guess it would have been the 34th.
A little earlier.
Yeah, but yes. And I went in and we began a conversation that eventually led to me moving into banking. And the reason I chose banking is I wanted to be in a place where I at least felt or believed that I could have a greater impact on my community than I was in the artistic fields.
Do you think you had a bigger impact as a banker or as a small business director?
Oh, now this is the greatest impact that I've been having.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's got to be
Yeah.
feel really good. At like just a nice to be like, oh, I'm literally helping
Yeah.
the boot on the ground people
When,
around me.
when I found my way to the chamber, Springfield Chamber, I started on their board and then on staff for about 5 years total. I expected that I would retire with chambers because they have a similar value proposition. They exist to help small businesses grow.
Yeah.
That's what chambers
Right
do.
when I talked with Brittany Quickwarner and I told her kind of like what I'm doing, she was like immediately like awesome. Just like in terms of like as the show grows, small business people come on and they reach a new audience without paying money for marketing.
Yeah.
So it's like she was like awesome. So no,
Yeah.
I really didn't know what the chamber did until I actually started speaking with some people there. I'm like, oh, they're the good guys.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, chambers definitely are. And chambers have very different shapes. Smaller chambers tend to focus on one or two things. Larger
Have shorter
chambers.
reverb. I'm kidding. Bigger chambers,
Bigger
very
chamber.
echoey.
I get it. I get it. Yeah, so a small chamber on the coast might do primarily visitor center work and then some networking. A chamber like Eugene and Springfield, they have government issue committees and economic development committees. They do a lot of different things, but all of it was to support businesses. When the email came across my desk about this position, I didn't know whether I could it.
Yeah.
Because my college background was in music. Actually, it was
Oh, that's funny.
yeah. I was
Nice.
music composition, and that doesn't directly flow into director of the
I was
SBDC.
kinesiology. Now I'm making a show.
Exactly. So, but I applied because I couldn't not apply. It was just so perfect. Because one of the reasons that I won't necessarily, I'll probably always do art in some fashion, but I wouldn't go back to it professionally, because what I've discovered is that the greatest art that I have to give is presentation and training and education.
Started
So
speaking, connecting with
yeah,
people, and I guess that's
yeah.
a massive. But people don't think of that skill. We just had someone. He was a OSU professor. Drove down yesterday and talked about just like children developing with sports and recess and how important they all are. And I'm like, I would be a big proponent of switching a kid like all the time. He's like, well, he wouldn't develop mastery of like one skill. He'd be like all off on these different things. I'm like, competence. But I'd be like, I would really impress upon my child the importance of understanding speaking and connecting with people as a skill that you can master no matter what skill you're actually doing at the time.
Yeah.
Because it's just so umbrella for every aspect of your life. So much of our life's interpersonal. I'm like, you're selling yourself to other people, you're connecting, you're understanding how you can help and not help each other. And it's like nobody ever teaches that. No one even puts that in kids' minds. That's a skill.
I couldn't agree more. I was in a 3-year high school, but my 3 years, all 3 years, sophomore, junior, senior year, I took a full year of what was called forensics, which was speech and debate.
Wow.
And I find it criminal that public speaking, and learning to craft an argument, a cogent argument that makes sense, and to communicate that is not, it's just not standard fare in public education, because I did lots of things. And
Criminal,
I had
you hear that? That's
I
a
had-
big accusation.
Well, it
The
just
person making it.
is.
It is.
You
It
know,
is.
we send people out into the world without the ability to communicate what they're feeling. Much less speak professionally. They can't even communicate with other people what they're speaking because they're too shy. They're just not confident of their ability to put two words together that make sense. And I feel like it should be fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually thought I left high school presuming that everybody would understand how valuable this is and it would become more and more common, only to then get at a point where my kids are entering into high school and realizing that the speech clubs have all disappeared.
Yeah.
There's hardly any of them around anymore.
No, it's going the opposite direction. If anything,
stunned.
I mean, so do your kids use TikTok? Kenzie and I use it. On my official job actually at Arcimoto is making TikToks. Yet I see if I had a kid, I'd be like, this is poison. This is my cure, but this is your poison, because there's so much just like I'm almost starting to look at it like same with Reddit. Like when you're scrolling and you see like all these really quick things, it kind of like turns your brain to mush a little bit in the aspect of you don't have any like deep knowledge in one thing. You learn all this like, oh, that's a cool trick. Oh, that's a cool life hack. Oh, that's a cool way of doing this thing. And then you don't really remember any of it. Even like the minute that you close it, you're like, it's like waking up from a dream. You're like, oh, it was so cool if I could just remember what it was. And then you describe it to people like Ken Zero. I'll watch a funny TikTok and we'll describe it to the other person. Never lands. So it's not even like you're learning funny jokes or anecdotes. It's like there's a lot of like junk food media that more than ever. Like I would say, even though it's tastier and more like comforting, which is, I mean, that's what junk than Facebook. Like everyone used to get on Facebook for being junk food for people's brains, and I'm like, oh, Facebook is good compared to like what's currently going on in the kind of sphere of media.
Well, I can't disagree. I've got my boys. I'm fortunate. I've got one. My oldest is he just doesn't pay attention to that stuff. He's in his own head. He's a scientist. He's his own thing. And my youngest, he's on, but he is very artistic and kind of walks his own path. My middle son is probably the most social, probably the most active, and I feel really good. He's now he'll be a sophomore in college, and I feel really good about his just his social acumen, and he sees he understands when something is positive or affirming or not.
It's so interesting to start reading social situations and then understanding like, oh, it doesn't always relate to me.
Yeah.
So I've been starting to give this book away. Have you ever read Og Mandino or The Greatest Salesman in the World?
Yes, absolutely.
That's so okay. You're like the second or third person who's ever recognized. I've given away 65 copies. I'm trying to hit 100 by the end of the year because you start reading it every day, and it's been like very beneficial. And like the chapter I'm currently on is Today I'll Master My Emotions. Like pretty much like someone who I think their phrase. So I'm on day 2 of this chapter. So like last chapter I read for 30 days. The person who won't buy gold chariots for a penny today will sell his house for a tree tomorrow. And like in many ways, our mood reflects what we'll buy so much to the extent that yesterday I came across like, can you put it on a new album? It's like a 4-stem player. And I was like, oh, I'll buy that. But then like other times I'll be like, $3 for this little thing. And I'm like, wow, mood dictates what we buy and how we interact with people to an extent that you got to lend that understanding to others when you're interacting with them, and it's like not a positive environment. It's like that could just be them today. Their partner could have left, or their whatever happened, and we always just like, no, I'm going to take my knowledge of the situation, and now I don't like this person, or now I do, and it's like it really kind of puts things in perspective, understanding that other people have their own lives. Give people as much grace as they need.
Yeah. We could stand to give people and ourselves greater grace. And that's one of the. It doesn't sound like a business, a point of business education, but one of the points that I start with, especially when I'm talking with brand new business owners, people who are just getting started, is to not beat themselves up for the things that they don't know, because nobody expects them to know it. Only people who have gotten an MBA, they've gone through college, they've gotten their MBA.
They're the real useless ones.
Well, I was going to say that, they should expect to at least know the basics, but sometimes that's a handicap because life doesn't roll out in the way that it's described in the textbooks. It just doesn't happen that way, and so it's very often that even an academically educated business person struggles with the real world. I think it was Steve Blank.
What a good last name.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks like you don't remember his last name. You're leaving it blank for now.
So Steve Blank was actually one of the fathers of the accelerator movement. So, he's a big name in the lean startup world. But I think he was the one who said, no business plan survives first contact with a client, right? So no matter how great a plan you put together, as soon as you open the door, as soon as that first person walks in, things are off the rails.
Yeah, Arcimoto has that with doors. They don't have doors on their vehicles, and almost every time. When's there going to be doors, though? And now they do have doors, but it's funny to kind of think. So, keeping in perspective and not naming these 2 books, Greatest Salesman in the World and 0 to 1, what's a small business book that you think is like better and more like helps people be equipped more than like getting an MBA or like all these more useless things? Are you a proponent of 0 to 1?
I don't know 0 to 1.
It was like Peter Thiel's book. It was like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was like
Okay.
massive in the
Yeah.
startup community, but
Okay.
it almost promoted the opposite. It's like, go for a monopoly.
Yeah.
Go, it was like the exact opposite of much of what you do. So I'm like, maybe you don't like that book. Maybe leave that one off the table.
Yeah. So for me, the books that I recommend, so the books that I recommend are less about business and more about learning how to think.
Oh, don't drop
becoming
the art of war. Don't be one of those people. No, I'm kidding. No, it can be philosophical books. Now I'm really curious.
Well, so for
Where the
Pete's sake.
sidewalk ends?
No.
Not that direction either.
So 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Cool.
Okay, so that is a
Sounds very familiar.
fantastic. It's from the 90s, and it is maybe the best book on just understanding what just fundamental, what creates fundamental human success.
Nice.
Things like start with the end in mind. First, seek to understand, then to be understood. Things like
Nice.
that. It's a beautiful book. In terms of business, specifically business.
That's good enough. I'm happy with
Oh,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you okay getting like minorly political just because it's very recent, kind of hot on my mind, an event that occurred?
Okay.
Local business had to deal with putting a COVID vaccine mandate to their company. And I thought it's because like they were just really just caught up in the news and they were like, oh, I just want to make sure the community isn't getting hurt. But then I overheard them explaining it to the employees because they had like everyone who was unvaccinated talk to the person, and he was like, I'm concerned that you're all going to get sick and go out at one time and I'm going to lose production. But if he did mandate it immediately, maybe they'd all quit or lose them all. So it's like there's so many catch-22s, and in the current world, are you seeing more small businesses like mandate things, or like do you have any suggestions for like small businesses facing something like that?
So, yeah, that's a really hard thing to speak on. I have my own personal opinions, but in my role as a supporter of small business, I have to back up and acknowledge that a business is the creation. It is the child of its owner, its founder, and they have the right, within what is regulated, they have the right to mandate or not whatever they choose.
Yeah.
And I have to respect that. My job is not to judge or tell others.
More though so than judging, like would you have advice for someone in the catch-22 position like that, where
Oh.
it's you're darned if you do, darned if you don't kind of thing? Like that's the first time I've ever seen like a glimpse into what it's like to run a company with many employees and have to make decisions that then affect tons of people and their family and the community in a large way, and being like, no matter what decision you make, I mean, do any of these philosophy books help with really hard decisions? Because it wasn't even my decision to make, and I was like, that's one of the harder decisions aside from like who you're with in life, where you live, and what you do, like the 3 big decisions.
Yeah.
Like that's a day-to-day decision that I've never faced, and I've never like, whoa,
So if I were asked how would I approach that if I were in their position? I'm a huge fan of organizational storytelling. If I had to make a decision like that, I would craft a story. If one was not available to me, I would craft a story. This is the future that I want to see in the time that we're in this thing that we're experiencing now. I would like us to be able to get through this time, healthy and safe, if that was the decision that I had made. And these are the reasons. So I would tell the story of families kept safe if that was the decision that I was making. If, on the other hand, I did not want to mandate, then I would craft a different story that reflects my values, and I would share the story of that living out, sort of what I call a successive vision story. So you look into the future, and you say, "This is the future that I am envisioning based on the decisions and work we're doing now."
I like that. Probably a really good way of relating to people.
Yeah.
I've never thought of like a company kind of storytelling to relate to employees in that way. And it's going to be a breakneck shift away, but I wanted to ask this because, I mean, we're actually almost running out of time,
Okay.
surprised or not. I've recently been do you know what Reddit is? Are you familiar with it? Curious what subreddits you're on. No, I'm curious.
No.
But I recently got into following each of the different political, like the political, there's like 4 quadrants.
Yep.
And I follow like the biggest subreddit of each of them, so I get to see like, okay, well, what's the benefit of social left, social right, economic left, economic right, authoritarian, and one that keeps coming up, and every point they make, I'm like, that's really good, is anarcho-capitalist. So like more of smaller government and more free market based, which is the exact opposite. I mean, if you asked me when I was in college, I was literally like, oh, strong socialism, communism, just try it again.
Yeah.
And now I'm shifting almost the complete other direction. Like, I'm like, what are the biggest faults with having smaller government and more free market?
So this is
Because
my
in many ways,
opinion.
your government. And
Yes.
So you're like the
Yeah.
opposite of that. So
Yeah.
so what's the worst side of the direction that I'm seeing as moderately appealing? Obviously, I'll never move away from the middle, but it's fun to like entertain different ideas and be like, well, what's the good and bad of this route in life, you know?
So, speaking personally, so this is my own personal belief, I believe we are at a point in human evolution where those who fail to thrive within the systems that we've created should be supported at a reasonable level. I'm all for robust capitalism, for limiting regulation as much as possible. The lesser regulation there is, the more losers there will be. There are people who simply will not thrive in that system, and we need to have a way to support them. That support requires a certain amount of regulation. It requires safety nets. It requires some of that. So,
such as environmental. The earth can be the loser as well in
exactly,
that situation.
Exactly. I do not believe in. I don't think that we have proven that complete lack of regulation will necessarily create or generate ethical action.
Yeah.
I don't think we've ever proven that, and I'd be happy to have conversations with anybody who disagrees.
Yeah.
But in my opinion,
Would you really, though?
I would.
Someone just spends all their time reading all the good sides of their argument.
Yeah.
Those people are the worst people to have conversations with.
So I briefly, after I left the banking industry, I ran the City Club of Central Oregon, and I ran a dialogue series where I brought people together on very with dissimilar views and on really divisive topics like gun control, education, immigration,
Sounds like a
things like that.
blast. Yeah.
It was an absolute blast. So yes, I would legitimately like to have those conversations.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, it's my biggest realism, like, when I was getting into it, and I was like, okay, full sail, we go into this. What's the biggest problem? Is the understanding of, like, generational wealth builds up, and then the free market tends to just be some families or some companies get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like, almost like you need a massive death tax or whatever it is to somehow stunt one family from the oil giants 200 years ago who are transitioning into whatever, from just dominating the landscape forever. I'm like, there's definitely downsides of literally every opportunity or every option that we have for an economic way of transacting between humans. Like, there is no like, oh, that'll work 100%. And then the middle ground almost doesn't have radical enough action to get us out of the jam we're in terms of the environment and just massive wealth inequality. Like, we're in this weird place where no matter what radical change we're going to have, it's going to rubber band back and have its own downsides. It just seems like this really big, and maybe like all generations have felt this way, but it seems like the near future is a very precarious place, doesn't it, in terms of what actions and directions we're going to take.
So I think that it would behoove us all to think about the concept of less regulation, and whether that means less regulation that supports a current system which seems to be aggregating wealth at the top. Do we need less regulation, or do we actually need more regulation to protect small and medium-sized businesses so that they have the ability to compete?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's something that we should be thinking about more.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we wrap up the show, do you have anything you want to promote or people to reach out to you on Twitter or anywhere specific?
So,
any plugs?
Any plugs? Yeah. So if anybody's interested in what the SBDC does, we've got lanesbdc.com, and SBDC stands for Small Business Development Center. So they can go there, check us out. They can contact me through that, and that's easy to find.
Beautiful. One link in the description. Easy enough.
Yes.
Unless you have another thing.
Yes. One more thing.
Yeah.
One more thing. for anybody who is in business, who's running their own business now, and would like to really get good at the art and science of business ownership. There is a program we've been running for 38 years called Small Business Management. It's a 9-month cohort program. Absolutely lauded instructor. He's been running it now for over a decade, and the next cohort starts in September. So reach out if anybody is interested.
Awesome. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
It has been a pleasure.
Take
Thank
care,
you, Tiger.
everyone. Bye.